Hi, this is Miss Lancaster. I am just doing actually our last video of the semester to kind of give you some brief overview of Chapter 9, which is Constructing Gender and Sexuality. So as you're reading through this chapter, kind of pay attention to the recognition that both sex and gender are socially constructed ideas. So when we think about what they are, it's society has defined them and determined them based on certain situations. Okay, so there's the essentialist approach, which basically says that gender roles are genetic and biological in nature. And then there is the constructionist approach, which actually talks about the social construction and acknowledge the possibility that gender roles have changed and will continue to change over time, where an essentialist would be like, they're set in stone based on our genetics. Okay, so those two different mindsets that we see in relationship to gender and sexuality. So what is really the difference between sex and gender? They're not the same thing. However, in society, we do oftentimes use these two terms kind of intertwined. They're intertwined and kind of use one for the other all, on a regular basis, but they're not exactly the same thing. But that is very much an essentialist approach, because from an essentialist approach, sex determines your gender. Okay, so sex is the biological term that refers to the ascribed physical or perceived physical differences between males and females. Gender is the socially constructed ideas that place our gender roles and our gender expectations and our gender identity and our gender expression. Okay, those are all socially constructed ideas of what should be taking place, and how you should feel or act based on your biological sex. That's when we intertwine them. However, you can be biologically male, however, your gender and the way that you identify yourself may not necessarily be the same. Okay, so that would be what a transgender individual is, or a questioning individual is, where a cisgender individual is somebody whose gender identity, and gender expression match their sex. Please, while going through the information that I've given you for this chapter, make sure that you look at the genderbread person visualization that I've given in the Blackboard course. That will help kind of see how they are all a little bit separated, right? Sex, gender, and gender identity and sexuality are not all the same. They're not necessarily intertwined. All of these things are kind of on a spectrum, recognizing that. This chapter really is the last of our inequality chapters, and it's talking about gender inequality, which is inequality that is based around those gendered ideas. Okay, so opportunities and resources vary based on whether you are biologically male or biologically female, or whether you are cisgender or transgender, or and anywhere else on the spectrum. Our society, as well as others, are patriarchal in nature, which means they are male dominated. Means when we think about the dominant groups in society are those that have the most power, as we've been discussing all semester long. So even though some societies may be more patriarchal than ours, our society is still patriarchal because men tend to be those that have the most power and influence. Gender stratification, just think about this, it's just a continuation of, instead of looking at income stratification, right, that layer of categorizing individuals, or racial categorization like we did in the last chapter, gender stratification is really how we can kind of look at the stratification that takes place based on whether you are male, whether you're female, whether you are cisgender, whether you are transgender, or again, anywhere on that spectrum. And there's places that we are on the social ladder, right, can lead to discrimination or privilege, right? We've been learning about that all since chapter 7. So when we talk about our life chances and our life opportunities and the ability or the recognition of strata of discrimination, excuse me, can take place based on these characteristics as well, which is again why this is a inequality chapter. We have to really think about how gender roles are reinforced and taught to us through socialization and how those life chances affect us. Thinking about theory from a functionalist perspective, we're going to come back to everything in society has a purpose and a function. So they see sex and gender as having a purpose and a function in the idea of the instrumental role and the expressive roles in society with the sex role theory. So make sure that you take a look at that. From a conflict perspective, we would look at how this theory talks about how there is the dominant group and the minority groups in society, and our society would see males as dominant and females as subordinate. Okay, does not necessarily mean that that is the way that it should be, because what conflict theory would say is that those that feel oppressed should and will eventually come together and make for change. So if we think about the women's rights movement, feminist movement, things like that can kind of show this evidence of those that feel oppressed. Now, one of the big differences between when we think about gender inequality is that we live amongst ourselves, that, you know, men and women live together in many situations, right? Interact on a daily basis, where when we think about racial and ethnic, we may not interact with people who are different from us. So there is, again, from this conflict perspective, inequality and conflict in all social relationships. So when we recognize that those gender roles can be oppressive, and when we say that, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's only oppressive for women. It can also be oppressive for men because it makes them have to be a certain way as well. Symbolic interactionism talks about the symbols and the meanings and the understandings. If we just think about gender in general, it's packed full of symbols, right? And interactions, meanings that are taught to us through interactions, thinking about socialization. As you continue through, make sure that you understand the feminist movement, the women's movement, and the men's movement that's discussed in your textbook. Let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you have a great day.